So, if you remember, we're looking at a grand theme throughout the whole Bible of, well, not just the temple as we think of it in terms of buildings, but any sacred space, any sanctuary, any place of an encounter between God and man. Starting with Eden, the Garden of Eden, and then what God has been doing right the way through the scriptures in order to get us back eventually in the new heaven and the new earth. And part of that aim has been to think about what it means when God said through Paul that we are now the temple of the Holy Spirit. And so we bear that in mind in all these talks. And one day we will actually focus on that as the main point of our meeting together. So it's part of the temple throughout the Bible, but it's in particular encountering God through these various temples, sacred spaces, and so on. And we ended last time by thinking about the patriarchs and the altars that they built. We thought about Jacob and Bethel. But by the time they all went down to Egypt, there are several such sacred spaces that have been placed in the land. But now they're back, or they're coming back into the land from Egypt. And the next big biblical character is, of course, Moses. And for Moses, altars would also play a very crucial role. Obviously, in the tabernacle to come, and that's what we're focusing on more next time, the actual tabernacle itself. But Moses also learnt to build altars. He built one, for instance, when he defeated the Amalekites, and he called it "The Lord is my banner." And particularly interesting time in which he was told to build an altar. And I stress again, God initiates these things. He tells them when to do something, where to do it, and how to do it, all the way through in this. And there's a fascinating example in Exodus 20, just outside of our main readings as such, but in Exodus 20, Moses is told to make an altar of earth for the purposes of burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. And then it also seems to anticipate that other altars are going to be made, which will be stone altars. So we're moving towards something made out of stone, and God is very particular about it. They are to be built from undressed stones. That means stones that are not cut or shaped by tools. Now, that would be something that I think the Israelites would have spent the past generations doing, cutting and shaping stones and making bricks in a certain pattern so that they could put them together. They would be used for altars and temples to idols. And they knew how to do this. That was their skill. But it's as though God is saying, I don't want you to do it that way. Your altars are going to be different. They're just going to be like a pile of stones. And we think of like dry stone walls that we see in the countryside today. Don't cut them, don't shape them so they all fit together perfectly, but they will join together in a particular way. And that already makes me think ahead to us being living stones as part of being the temple of the church of our God. And when God chooses us to be a living stone, he takes us as we are, our natural shapes and sizes and all the rest of things, because that's how he wants to work with us. He doesn't want us all cut up into identical blocks. He wants our originality. He wants our variation, not some kind of slavish uniformity. Slavish uniformity is something you find within sects and cults, isn't it? Where everybody has to be conformed to the single person leading it all. In God's temple, and we are living stones, he wants us to be integrated, yes, and we get knocked into shape a little bit once we're joined together, but he joins us together as individually distinct into the one spiritual house that he's building for his glory and purposes. So already, as I say, I've moved ahead into thinking about what it means for us, that we're not cut and shaped in advance. God takes us as we are and brings us together so that he can then work on us within the context of each other. So altars are going to remain significant for all the physical temples still to come, including the tabernacle, as I say, next time. The tabernacle had 2 altars, so that would be interesting to think about. And it's the desert sanctuary, the tabernacle, which is going to dominate the life and ministry of Moses for decades. And there'll be a lot to think about from there. But what I want us to do today is to think about the personal encounters that Moses had prior to the actual construction of the tabernacle. And so we've got three dramatic events or series of events: the burning bush, Mount Sinai, and then something called the tent of meeting. And that's why I wanted three different readings. So firstly, we have this burning bush, this strange sight of a bush engulfed in flames, not being burnt up. And as you heard from the reading, Moses was tending the flocks of his father-in-law Jethro and took a long journey to find better pasture for them. And he came to a mountain which was called Horeb. Now that is actually the same as Sinai, as it would be known later. So that was the first meeting of God and Moses, was actually at this mountain, but it was through something very small but very powerful, which was this burning bush. It certainly drew his attention. He wanted to go nearer to find out what was going on, and that's when he received a call on his life that he probably neither expected nor particularly wanted. But you can't avoid it sometimes. God speaks to him out of the bush. In fact, he calls his name out twice: Moses, Moses. And that's one of the examples throughout Scripture of what we sometimes call the double call on someone's life, the name being repeated to really make sure that God has got Moses' attention in this case. But he was told he was standing on holy ground and he wasn't to get any closer, and he had to remove his sandals as a mark of respect. Now, this bush is not a temple in any sense, doesn't qualify for that, but for a limited amount of time and for a very specific purpose, it became a sacred space, and it had a big impact upon Moses. Clearly, this was a supernatural event involving the presence of God, and it was probably a bit of a scary time for Moses when this happened, but he would have been reassured because God declared himself to Moses as the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And that was the God that Moses knew. This was the covenant he already knew, the covenant that God had made with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. So Moses suddenly felt secure again. Oh, yes, this is the God I know. This is not some other God that I don't know. And it was part of the covenant. But he's going to learn that God also wants to be known as another name through the name of Yahweh, which is often translated as I am, but which actually can be taken to mean the God who is always was, always will be, and so on. But Moses has this initial encounter with God as a commission to take the lead in the next stage of God's dealings with the people of Israel. And he in fact receives the promise at this stage that he will one day be back at this special mountain and known as Sinai with the people of Israel. And so that's where we go now. We go skip through several chapters. Quite a lot happens, of course, as you know, in the Exodus story itself. But we're now thinking about Sinai itself. And we can ask the question again, does this mean that mountain became a temple as part of our story? And some of the extra-biblical Jewish traditions do regard Sinai as an equivalent of a temple, or at least our holy place. But I noticed that within the scriptures, it's never quite mentioned in those terms. And it's not a temple, it's not a sanctuary, it's not even something like the house of God, which was going to refer to the temples to come. It is referred to as the mountain of God, and therefore I think that qualifies it as a sacred space, but I wouldn't put it in the list of temples as such. But it is a place where God came in power and with intent. And that intent was to meet with Moses and speak with him. God is going to now initiate a series of encounters with Moses, similar to that at the burning bush, but with even more impact, more drama, if you like. And it wasn't just for Moses this time, it would be for the people of Israel as a whole, because God now had a purpose he was going to start to work out. He was going to take this collection of tribes and turn them into a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. That's in Exodus 19. It's not just in the New Testament. They, first of all, were going to be turned into a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, a people set apart for himself so that he can come and dwell amongst them. That's the whole point behind all these temples, is that God wants to come and dwell amongst his people, wants to meet with them and live with them. Now, in looking at this, I was faced with a very interesting question. I don't know how well you get on with this particular question, but it was, how often do you think Moses climbed to the top of the mountain in order to speak with God? Bear in mind, it'd be quite a long and arduous climb. So how many times? And I thought, well, maybe 2, maybe 3, I don't know. And if we were doing this like sort of live together, we had loads of time, I would now say to you, well, you have a little think and read through from Exodus chapter 19 onwards and see how many you can come up with. It will be far more than you think, almost certainly, unless you've studied this before. So if you want to have Exodus 19 ready, I'm going to take you very quickly through some of these. But the important thing in the end is not have we got the right numerical answer, but to understand in each case why Moses was called to the top of Sinai and what happened there. What did God actually say to him? Did he go alone? Did others go with him? And if so, how far? Well, I think that there's about 8 times that Moses ascended the mountain of Sinai to be in the presence of God. That's a lot of steps, if you like. It's a lot of effort. It's a lot of time and trouble. Now, you could argue it's only 7. You could argue it's 9. It's difficult sometimes to quite be sure which one started when and which one ended when. But we're not interested in just a number. We're interested in the purpose of this. It does start in Exodus 19, verse 3. So if you want to do a little bit of study later on, make a note of that, where Moses goes alone to receive a message of God to take back to the people. It's a short message. It's just verses 4 to 6, but it's an important one because it'll prepare them for the covenant that's to follow. And we know that's it because in verse 7, Moses goes back down the mountain to relay this message to the people. That's quite sort of clear and distinct. Verses 3 to 7, one journey, one message, back he goes. And the good news is their response is very positive. They like what he's bringing them back from God and about the covenant that he has for them and so on. And Moses, therefore, reports this back to the Lord, which means that he might have had another trip up the mountain in order to tell God that. And at this point, we're not quite sure whether it's another one or another 2 and so on, because Moses goes up the mountain again. He certainly comes back down again in verse 14, but some people say he's actually, that's his 3rd trip and he's been up in the meantime and so on. But said the main point is not to realise exactly the numerical amount, but there's at least 2 so far, just by the time we get to chapter 19 and verse 14. Important point is that the people themselves have now come to realise that God is speaking to them through Moses and that they are to go no further than the foot of the mountain. And there was a warning with great consequences. The mountain is at the moment set apart as holy, a sacred space, even if we don't think of it as a temple. Well, he goes up again 3 days later. This is now chapter 19 and verse 20, and he comes back down again in verse 25. So we've got another clearly defined visit and another set of instructions for him. One of the things that he's told is that next time, Aaron will be allowed to go with him. So he's already been up and down the mountain 3, maybe 4 times, and we now reach chapter 20, which is where God speaks what has become known as the 10 Commandments. Now, what is often overlooked at this point, and I didn't quite realise this, is that when God speaks the 10 Commandments in the first instance, Moses is not at the top of Sinai. He's back at the bottom with the people. This is not the tablets of stone bit. This is an audio-visual experience for everyone, where they all hear the thunder and the lightning, a full sort of light and sound show, if you like, in which God speaks the 10 Commandments that Moses must have been able to hear. But they're still now at a distance, the people and Moses at this point. But God has spoken the 10 Commandments at that particular point. But the next thing we read in chapter 20, verse 21, up he goes again. This time he ascends into the presence of God to receive even more laws to tell the people. But he also gets some promises to take back to them as well. An angel will guard them and guide them as they travel, and that God will give them the land and establish their borders. And that all happens in Exodus 21 to 23. So this is a longer visit with more instructions, following on from the Ten Commandments, more information, more promises, and also information about his next visit, because next time there can be Aaron and 2 of his sons and 70 elders, but they must keep their distance. We're now getting the sense that Moses is allowed all the way to the top to approach the Lord. Some others were allowed part way up, but not right into the presence of God directly. And so in Exodus 24 and verse 9, they all set off again. And we've got, but I think now might be the 5th visit and so on. Everyone but Moses was meant to keep their distance, although they did have an experience of God in some way, part way up, and they lived to tell that. But Moses is summoned to go further up at the same time. And at this point, Joshua, as Moses' assistant, is also allowed to go further. So we've now got another trip coming up, if you like, Exodus 24, verse 12 onwards, which is a very specific one and was going to last a lot longer. And this is the one that I wanted read out for various reasons. Because at the start of this day, I don't know if we got to number 6 now or whatever, it doesn't really matter, Moses sits silently in the presence of God for 6 days, waiting to hear from him. Have you ever sat that long in the presence of God, waiting to hear from him? It must have been very tempting to think halfway through, well, there's nothing happening this time, I better go back. But no, he waits, sitting silently for 6 days. And of course, it was worth it, because on the 7th day, God spoke to Moses from out of the cloud. And that's the visit that would last 40 days and 40 nights. And that's when he received the 10 Commandments on tablets of stone, and in particular was given very lengthy and detailed instructions for the creation and furnishing of a new sanctuary that would become known as the tabernacle. And the key verses there, which I'll read out again, but they were at the end of one of our readings, Exodus 25, verses 8 and 9. Then let them make a sanctuary for me, and I will dwell amongst them. So now he's going to say, I'm going to come down, I'm going to get closer. But you've got to make a sanctuary for this to happen. Make this tabernacle and all its furnishings exactly like the pattern I will show you. Stress that again. Make this tabernacle and all its furnishings, but exactly like the pattern I will show you. It's like, if you do it the way I say, then I will come. But you've got to do it the way I say. God is now saying, I've redeemed you. I've given you my law. I want to come and dwell closer with you in a new and more permanent way. And this is a significant step. Closer encounters would now be possible, but only if they made the tabernacle exactly as God instructed. We're going to find this again and again. We've already seen it a little bit with the altars, with the Garden of Eden, all being built exactly as God wanted. It'll be the same with the temples. And I'm going to suggest that this is one of the big takeaway points for us. Are we building the church as God intends? Are we letting him build it, his instructions? Because Jesus said, I will build the church. We're prepared to be living stones that will be built according to the pattern that God instructs for the church, the ecclesia that he wants. I think we've got too many man-made examples, but as I say, we'll discuss that another time. So this was a long, involved visit up there, perhaps because the details were so lengthy, and it was crucial that he understood them. But in the meantime, the Israelites waiting at the bottom of the mountain, as you know, got very impatient. They couldn't understand what was happening. They thought perhaps he got lost or died or something. And so they entered into idolatry. They fashioned an idol of gold in the shape of a calf and worshipped that instead. They just couldn't wait. They couldn't wait for Moses to come back, though they did their own thing. Interesting, isn't it? God actually told Moses, while Moses was still up there, that when he gets down, he had found that this has happened. So God knew what was happening. Moses was given the warning. And he gets back, and as you know, he's so angry, he throws the tablets of stone to the ground and they break into pieces. And so the next thing we learn in Exodus 32 is Moses goes all the way back up again, and this time he goes to intercede for the people before the Lord. And then there's one more trip in Exodus chapter 34, you'll find that there, which also lasts 40 days and 40 nights, another very long trip. When Moses returned, he had the 2 new stone tablets with the commandments written on them. And this time, this was when his face was so radiant, people were afraid to come near. But he brings back good news. God had shown mercy. He had forgiven them. The relationship was restored. The tabernacle could still be built. And this time, as I say, he comes back with new tablets of stone, which is going to be important because they're going to feature within the tabernacle itself. Now, I said in all that, the exact number of trips is not the key thing, but certainly there's a lot more than I thought I was going to find, and probably it's caught you by surprise a little bit. But this was an important series of encounters for the whole people of Israel themselves, because this was now a big step in their life together, as God was creating for himself a new nation with new laws to guide them into the way of life he wanted. He was showing them how much he really desired to communicate with them and to forge a relationship with them so that he could dwell with them. But the other takeaway at this point is that it's quite clear at the moment there's still a sense that God is very distant because he's situated at the top of a mountain. He's very remote. It took a lot of time, a lot of trouble for Moses to go and meet God. And no one else was allowed to come certainly as close as that, and most were not allowed to come anywhere near. And we've already got out of this then, this 3 distinct levels of accessibility, which is going to stay right the way through the tabernacle and the temples, and actually which we saw back in the Garden of Eden when we thought about that as a sacred space. But what's going to be known as the outer court for everyone, the inner court for the priests, and then the most holy place, the Holy of Holies, for one person only, the high priest. And it's like the mountain has taken on that significance where everybody could be at the bottom, a few could come halfway up or get a bit closer, but only one person was allowed into the presence of God, and it became a very fearful place. So there's a pattern set up there. And the other significant thing, which I've mentioned and I'll just stress again, is that the command to build the sanctuary exactly as God decreed. And that included all the items within it, not just the basic structure. And next time we'll think about what it is that God did insist on and perhaps why some of that remains important. But I said there was a third one to mention a bit more briefly that we find in these chapters in Exodus, and that's the idea of the tent of meeting. The tent of meeting is a phrase which we come across, and that's why I had the third reading read. And the question is that the same as the tabernacle, or is this another tent? And that gets a bit confusing unless you look at it very carefully. In the passage that we heard read from Exodus 33, verses 7 to 11, we read that Moses used to take a tent and pitch it outside the camp some distance away. And he called it the Ohel Moed, the tent of meeting. Now that has a location entirely different from where the tabernacle is going to be situated, which was going to be in the middle of the camp. The people were going to be surrounding the tabernacle. But this is a separate tent that Moses took and pitched it way outside the camp, which is quite large. If you think how many people are there, it's a long way away. And the other thing about it is it's nothing like as elaborate or constructed according to the instructions on Sinai. This is just, if you like, another tent. And it seems to have come from the initiative of Moses himself. And we read about it, that it was for anyone wanting to inquire upon the Lord. And Moses now could go into that tent, and the pillar of cloud would come down and stay at the entrance while the Lord spoke with him face to face as one speaks to a friend. Only Joshua was allowed to be at all near. The people watched from their own tents. So there was a an initial tent of meeting purely for Moses, which he pitched outside the tent. Well, why was this? Well, perhaps he was fed up with going up the mountain all the time, and he thought, can we not do something else and get a bit closer to that? But it would take over a year, or about a year, to construct the tabernacle according to the details, to collect all the offerings that were going to be given, and to make it exactly as God intended. And we're told in Exodus chapter 40, and it's verse 17, that the tabernacle was eventually set up on the first day of the first month of the second year of their travels. Right. So it's as though during the time in which that tabernacle was being constructed, Moses put up a temporary tent where he could still meet with God. So they're not the same. But what becomes a bit more confusing is that later the tabernacle does become known as the tent of meeting. So we have to think first of all of Moses' tent of meeting and a later priestly tent of meeting. And it's possible that once the tabernacle was in place, that the one that Moses had used perhaps then fell into disuse. It wasn't needed anymore. Well, I'm not sure we really know too much about that. But that's why there's some confusion about it. But the one that we read that Moses used early on in chapter 33 was while the tabernacle was being built and before it was inaugurated. But there was another special place for Moses where he could encounter God and receive words from him as he spoke to him face to face as a friend. And everybody else still had to watch from a distance and not be part of that, although Joshua was allowed close as well. So that's the life of Moses within this section of the scripture, the various encounters, various things that he was now involved with. And as I say, from now on, the tabernacle was going to be the thing that would dominate his life and ministry. And that's what we'll look at next time. So next time, as we look at the tabernacle, I wonder if there might be a few more surprises and tricky questions, because it wasn't just something for the desert travels, not just for a few decades, but the tabernacle, and in particular the ark, was going to be really significant for centuries to come. So that is another clear temple in our story. The tabernacle now is getting close to the biblical building temples that we know of, and it's going to be clearly an important step in this whole story of that. So that's 4 months' time. Thank you. And